Hello, I'm Kevin,
And I'm Jackson,
and this is A Disciple.
and a doubter.
Today, we are going to be discussing the topic of moralistic therapeutic deism. I know that's long, but before we get into it, we'll begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Holy Spirit, please come, breathe your life into us, dispel any darkness in our hearts and minds as we listen to your word. Amen. In the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. So, as I mentioned, moralistic therapeutic deism, which
What
is
the heck is that?
exactly it's a fairly modern. The term itself is fairly modern. It came from a study that I believe was conducted by a Notre Dame professor, a sociologist,
Yeah.
where he interviewed teenagers around the country from all sorts of faith denominations like Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and whatnot, and just asked them a bunch of guiding, just a bunch of prompting questions about what they thought about the role of faith in their lives. And would you like to explain a little bit about what it is he discovered exactly?
I think you can do that better than I can, but I can get us started.
Okay, and then
Um,
I'll fill in the gaps.
yeah, so uh, the idea is basically that most young people, but also like really just most people in general, kind of have this perspective of religion where um, the most important thing is to be a generally good person. And if you are a generally good person, um, then you are in good graces with God and you go to heaven. Um,
Yeah, I think that's hence the
yeah,
saying.
that's like a very
If we
he has
break
like
down
sorry,
the
go ahead.
name, if we break down the name moralistic, we'll start with that.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Basically, when he interviewed these teenagers, the main theme that kept reoccurring is just like, oh yeah, be nice to everyone, be kind, like don't be too judgmental, just more or less quote unquote be a good person. And the exact criteria of what constitutes a good person was not well thought out by the vast majority of these teenagers that were interviewed. And then the second part, therapeutic, is this idea that God Himself exists primarily just to kind of make you feel good about yourself. Like if you say a prayer, it's just kind of so that you feel good. And ultimately, the chief end in life is feeling good. Like feelings are the highest form of good, and there's really nothing greater than that. And deism kind of emphasizes the point that God does not play too much of an active role in our lives and is more or less just this therapist in the sky that you could call on occasion to make you feel better about yourself. And he generally expects you to be a good person, but what does constitute a good person is mostly subjective and is kind of just up to you. And whatever makes you feel good about yourself, you should just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, a moralistic therapeutic deist, and maybe this goes without saying, but wouldn't really care whether someone identifies with one religious tradition rather than another.
No, not
Like
at
for,
all.
for someone who would sort of like subconsciously subscribe to this way of looking at the world, than like someone who finds meaning in Christianity and someone who finds meaning in Buddhism or Islam, like they're doing the exact same thing according to a moralistic therapeutic
Yeah, like the
deist.
15-year-old boy from Indiana who was interviewed and who would fall under the category of moralistic therapeutic deist. If you were to say to him, "Oh, should Christians do Christians have an obligation to evangelize to Muslims, for instance?" He would say, "Oh no, I mean neither religion is really more correct than the other. It's just like I said, a matter of what makes you feel personally good about yourself."
Yeah.
So again, it does kind of go without saying that like moral relativism is heavily baked into this like religion we could call it. And by that I mean a moralistic therapeutic deist when it comes to specific moral principles, like there might be some object things that they would recognize as they would treat as objectively wrong, like murder.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to like sexual ethics, for instance, they would say, "Oh yeah, it's not objectively wrong to engage in premarital sex because as long as it makes you feel good, that's all that matters." And there's no rigorous moral study involved. Again, everything is just entirely feelings based because feelings are kind of the ultimate end, like the ultimate good. So I think we should discuss.
Can I actually I have somewhere I want to go with that.
Go ahead.
And maybe this won't be like a super like maybe this won't be something that we need to spend a significant amount of time on, but it's interesting for me because I think that you can have someone who would fit the description of a moralistic therapeutic deist, but who also is evidently living a very virtuous life. And what I mean by that is that, like, okay, if we break down the like the moralistic part,
Mhm.
like you could have someone who believes that the sort of the correct path to a good life, so to speak, or a life of flourishing is to be as virtuous as possible. Um, so I'm sort of
But I mean, the obvious question is, how do we define virtue? Like in some people's minds, virtue does not include like faith, hope, or love. It would just include like ambition and or like workaholism or my point being is there are different buckets of virtues and some people subscribe to more worldly things like workaholism or just ambition or willingness to be cutthroat. According to some people those are virtues.
mhm.
I think like
Well,
we would
let's say you have someone who engages in, certain like ascetic practices, not necessarily for the sake of any one religion, but just because they've ascertained that, asceticism, self-denial is like an important part of living a good and virtuous life. But then let's also say this person is of the opinion that no one religion is entirely correct, and that people can derive real meaning and fulfillment from um, a number of different religions, uh, and that there like doesn't exist this like super personal God as is proposed by Christianity and certain other religions. Like this person would be technically a moralistic therapeutic deist, but I think I think a person like that is living a far different life than sort of the moralistic therapeutic deist that's being described in Christian Smith's paper. And
yeah, no, because I think this stereotypical, like the image that he paints in your head, meaning like the author who conducted this study, is to someone who is just incredibly milquetoast, doesn't really have firm values about anything. They again, they literally exalt good feelings as the highest virtue. I would almost say, like, take the person that you described a second ago, the person who is very big into like self-denial and discipline and working super hard. I wouldn't necessarily say that person falls into the category of moralistic. Let's just call it MTD. I
okay,
wouldn't say
yeah,
that person falls into the category of MTD because that person does not exalt good feelings above all else. You know what I mean?
yeah,
And
yeah.
I think
That's because
for
yeah,
MTD, the highest good just has to be feeling good. Whereas that differentiates itself from Christianity, in which the highest good is love itself, and more specifically, like sacrificial love, similar to the love that Christ had for us on the cross, which, of course, does not involve is not just pure good feelings. It
hmm
involves like a willing embrace of sorrow. And so I think we could return to that other person who is virtuous but isn't a Christian. We could return to him later. But I
Yeah,
think
no, I think you are right, Kevin. Because
yeah,
I think like a central component of what's being described in this paper is like this very lax and like
yeah, like
carefree
very
way of going about
carefree,
life.
which is why when you say, "Oh, what does it mean to be a good person?" Like they would just the core tenets would revolve around like, "Oh yeah, just don't be judgmental, like let other people do what they want to do." Like that's what I would say that's how an moralistic therapeutic deist would likely define being a good person because I think the logic follows that if good feelings are the highest good, then the best thing you could do for someone else is support them in their lifestyle that brings about good feelings for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So therefore, being judgmental, quote unquote, inhibits someone else from feeling good about themselves. So therefore, it makes you not a good person to be judgmental. And I think it's interesting to note, and the author made a remark, Christian Smith remarked on this towards the end, is that there is no Church of Moralistic Therapeutic Deism. Like there is no official like theological organization dedicated to this faith.
Right, and no one calls themselves a moralistic
And
therapist.
no one says like, oh yeah, like what's your religion? Oh, I'm a moralistic like that would be dumb. They would still say most moralistic therapeutic deists would still say like, oh yeah, I'm Christian. Like I go to church on Christmas and Easter and like I was baptized and like, oh yeah, I believe in Jesus. He's a good guy. So they would still. My point being is they would still say they're Christian, but they wouldn't actually believe in the core tenets of the Christian faith. And then, so I guess really the point I'm getting at here is that it's not because of how lax it is, meaning like MTD as a whole. It's so lax that it can't stand on its own. It's kind of like a parasite that latches itself onto like actual faith traditions
Yeah.
and then leaves them as like a more bastardized version. Like MTD is like a bastardized version of Christianity because it does pull some tenets from Christianity. Like obviously, both Christianity and MTD say that it's good to be a good person,
Right.
and but obviously Christianity spells that out a little bit more. Um, I think we should talk about how MTDs came to be like the dominant religion in the Western world.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, yeah, I also like really try to ask the question of why it is something that seems to be so widely subscribed to on like a subconscious level, obviously. Um because I think it's easy for people like us to have this conversation and just totally condemn and put ourselves above people who may fall into this camp of MTD. But I think that's stupid, and no one wants to hear us sit here and just be moralists. Um, but yeah, I think it's important for us to ask the question of like, okay, like we recognize that this thing is this very lax religiosity and spirituality is very prevalent in our modern world. Why is that the case? I,
Yeah,
I don't know if you have any initial thoughts.
yeah. No, I'm trying to think like because I guess you have to figure. I guess it probably helps to start thinking about when Christendom started declining initially. I know a lot of people probably say it's around the time of the Enlightenment,
Hmm.
um, when like the scientific method came about, and people started to think to themselves like, "Oh yeah, why do we need like faith in this invisible, immaterial being when we can now explain so much about the world like through experimental analyses of material things and analyze cause and effect in a way that doesn't seem to point to a God. I would say that mode of thinking probably, that mode of thinking certainly hurt Western civilization and like Christianity's prevalence in Western civilization.
Yeah.
But then I think it's not just that though. Like, I would say there's been a very sharp decline in Christianity because obviously the Enlightenment started like 300 or 400 years ago, or maybe it was about that amount of time. I don't know, but
It was like the 1600s,
yeah. But
I think.
I would say probably like 70 to 80 years ago, Christianity definitely took another huge hit. Like, would you agree with that?
Wait,
In
sorry,
that,
you
like,
said 70 to 80 years ago?
I mean, I think most people have the general impression that, like, in in our grandparents' generation, and certainly in our great grandparents' generation, most people in society went to church every Sunday.
Hmm.
Whereas now, and I remember hearing some statistic that in the 60s, the Catholic Church was panicking because only 65% of Catholics were going to church every Sunday.
Hmm.
Whereas now the number is down to like 20% in the
Yeah.
United States. And then in other countries, like Europe and Australia, I should say like non-US Western countries, the numbers are even lower, like 13, like 10 to 13% of Catholics or Christians more broadly go to church every Sunday, which again compared to 65% in the 1960s. I'm not 100% sure these numbers are accurate, but like it's around that ballpark.
Yeah.
Like what happened in the past 70 years or so that has caused this decline? And I think it was probably the rise of
A part of it must certainly be the fact that life in the modern world is just, for most people,
so
particularly in
easy.
America, is so comfortable.
Yeah, no, that's got to be it, I think. Like I guess you figure around like the Industrial Revolution just
I
made life.
I think it's probably. I mean, I'm sure there's a myriad of factors in play here, but like what's coming up for me is the fact that life in the modern world is pretty easy for most people compared to what it's been in the past, coupled with the fact that like we have this this like scientific way of looking at this very scientific way of looking at the world now that uh like didn't exist in, for most of human history. And so it's like, okay, you have like your person living in the 21st century, and like, okay, one, their life is like generally not super hard, and so they don't have like this deep desire, this deep need to like cry out to some
Not
great,
super hard in the sense that like it's not as if five of their children die in
like
infancy.
their material needs are generally being met.
Yeah,
No,
like
there are like
no one,
certain.
no one is starving to death in the United States generally, unless they have some sort of like eating disorder. But it's not like it's yeah. I get what you're saying.
Mhm.
People's material needs are generally met.
Yeah, and so there's not like, you know as much of a need to cry out to something which has this power to save as there would have been, in past generations. And then you also have the fact that, like, that person is brought up in this culture that's very much like influenced by the scientific method. And so, like, they're obviously going to encounter religious claims in their life, but sort of based on the way that they've been cultured to evaluate the world, those religious claims are gonna feel a little bit silly, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the right word. Like it just seems silly when you don't actually think about like the rigorous intellectual depth behind like biblical stories.
And so I think it's one, life's just easier now in a material sense, and two, we're just cultured to look at the world in this very scientific way, which makes religious claims feel outdated and silly. And so it's like, why
'Cause
even this? Why do I
you
need?
have one of the central tenets of Christianity, which like we talked about a second ago, is that like we're called to view suffering as a sanctifying thing because as God became man, he entered like the deepest depths of human darkness and suffering, and therefore, as for all of us who suffer today, we're called to see it as like attaching our suffering to the cross of Christ and allowing us to be sanctified through this process. But I think kind of like what you were saying, if life is super easy, if all you need to do to get like a hit of dopamine is just take out your phone and like open TikTok or search pornography on the internet or something,
Hmm.
it's so easy to do these things. It takes no effort at all. And all of a sudden, like you've cured your boredom because you can now just scroll on TikTok. Like you can get whatever dopamine hits you want. So I guess you're right. Like people just don't feel the need to sit and hear God's voice anymore.
But sorry, are you going somewhere? Because I this is bringing up something else that's
Say,
related.
say what you want to say.
Because like what's really interesting here is that like if you are a devout Christian, then or sorry, most people who are devout Christians feel a responsibility to make the world a better place.
Hmm.
Uh, and oftentimes that manifests in a material way. Like improving, uh, like, like improving the living conditions for human beings is like a religious pursuit, can be a religious pursuit.
Yeah, for
Many,
sure.
many people who, sort of pursue these things do it from a kind of place of religious inspiration.
So maybe
And
what we should do is have a religious organization that strips everyone of their material goods so that they're forced to live in poverty and therefore more likely to cry out to God.
that's why this is so interesting because
That's a
like
joke, by the way,
like a
if you
large
listen.
I know a large part of the religious project is how can we make the world a better place, and we've actually been like religious people have been pretty successful in doing
See,
this
I
because
will
we have made
say,
the world a better place. But now that we've made the world a better place, people are less likely to be religious because things are just easier.
that's an interesting point. Um, it does not follow. It does not exactly follow that material affluence has come about through Christian charity, which has directly resulted to people being less religious. Like
Yeah,
that,
no,
it's
you're
not like an exact correlate, but there are. I will say that I made a joke about how we should start a Christian order that like strips people of their material goods. I would say, when I thought about it for a second, I was like, well, I guess there are some. Think about like Saint Francis, for instance. Like he started the religious order so that people could join and rescind their material goods. So like that actually is kind of a Christian thing. Like it's
Mhm.
voluntary. We don't like steal people's goods, kind of thing. But to answer, but you're right. Like there are it is in accord with Christianity generally that we help meet, like feed the hungry, clothe the naked, kind of thing. And generally, like business is something that good business that leads to more material affluence is something that more Christians should be pursuing. But I think it kind of this reminds me of it kind of reminds me of the twofold character of private property that Pope Pius XI talks about in his encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, where he says that private ownership is a good thing because it's in accord with human dignity. That just as God created the world, we human beings have been endowed with this unique rational capacity to plan and create things of our own. And just as God owns his creation, we, through our subjective personal nature, in employing our rational capacities to create things, can justifiably own things of our own. So businesses producing things like market principles and economics, like these are all good things. However, like I said, there's a twofold character of private property. The first is the personal aspect. We can own things, but the second is the social aspect, meaning like even though we do own things, we have to have a healthy detachment from the goods we own. And like we have to recognize that all of our blessings come from God. And in doing so, serve as stewards of creation, in that we like justly distribute our resources in a way that respects the human dignity of all people. So I think to more directly address your point, it's like it's a good thing to pursue material affluence, but we have to do so with a spirit of healthy detachment, which is not easy to do. It's very easy to fall in love with your wealth, I would think. So, or like cultivate the attitude that like I deserve all this, like I deserve to just hoard all my stuff to myself. And as soon as you have that attitude, then you've kind of made an idol out of material possessions. And anytime you make an idol out of anything, it's naturally going to lead you away from God.
Mm. I think you're thinking of this more on an individual level, or like for me, I'm thinking more on a societal level. Like, so if you look at like pre-revolution France, it was an incredibly religious country, but the vast majority of the population was very impoverished and lived very, very difficult lives. And you look at France post-revolution, you look at France now, like France is a first world country. They're doing pretty darn well. Most people live in circumstances that are generally comfortable, and France is just far less religious than it once was. And this is just a trend that seems to happen when the material situation in a country improves. The
It seems to just
religiosity of that
get
country
less religious.
declines. But it's like we would probably say that it's good that most people
Material
in
situations.
France aren't like super impoverished farmers who have to worry about starvation every other year when there's a famine. Like that's probably a good thing that that's not happening anymore. But at the same time, like 95% of France was religious back when that was the case, and now like 15% of France is religious or whatever.
And yeah, I think it's, again, I think people, myself included, like I'm not, again, we're not just trying to say we're above all this because Jackson and I are not. But like I think people do have to cultivate, like you said, an attitude of detachment. Like recognize, like I guess it takes like a scrupulous gratitude that we have to have for God for everything that we own, and also an acceptance of the fact that God has given us these things, meaning just material possessions in general, and He could also take them away. And like Job in the story of Job, when God, if slash when God does take away the worldly things we possess, we still have to have faith that God is ultimately all we need, and that these worldly things were more just mechanisms so that we could better serve God. Like if you're a family man, for instance, it's good to try to amass wealth, but not just so that you could hoard it, and be attached to it, and try to exalt yourself, but so that you could provide for your family. Because providing for your family is what ultimately makes you more saintly. So Again, I think we just have to recognize more the instrumental nature of material goods and not think of them as ends in and of themselves. But it's like, you're right. Why is it that societies generally have failed in that sense? Because you're right. It is kind of like, as societies get more materially wealthy, they become more spiritually impoverished, which I think is a term that Mother Teresa used when she visited the United States.
Yeah.
And because you would think that, like, if we had a firm foundation in Christianity to begin with, then we would know, like, oh yeah, we have to have a detachment from our goods, and we have to be grateful to God for everything. We have to recognize the instrumental nature of private property and how we have to be stewards of all that we own so we can serve others. But I guess, like, generation after generation, like, the more you kind of become detached from that idea, then just you're not going to pass on the faith to the next generation. And I would say that, like, because it is part of any given generation's job to pass on the faith to the next generation. So you might think, oh yeah, our grandparents failed to pass on Christianity, but I would argue that they did pass on the faith. Like, I know our grandparents' generations are a little older than boomers, but, like, the faith of the boomer generation is moralistic therapeutic deism. They passed that on to the millennials, and for the most part, the millennials are probably passing that on to Gen Alpha right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, how can we combat this? I think one thing, material, an unhealthy attachment to material things is probably one of the reasons, as we've been discussing at length here. I would say another one of the reasons, and you may disagree with me here, is just the general notion that as long as you're a good person, quote unquote, then salvation is promised to you. That kind of tries to strip away Jesus Christ from the picture. Because, like, it's my firm belief that Jesus Christ, like, the person himself, not the principles that he espouses, although those are significant, but, like,
Yeah.
the person of Jesus Christ himself is the means to salvation. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And I think there is this heresy within Christianity of, like, you could call it religious indifferentism, or you could call it just good personism, maybe.
Yeah.
This idea that, like, oh yeah, like, a relationship with Jesus or a strict adherence to tenets of traditional Christianity, they're just not important, because all that matters, as long as you feel good about the kind of person you are and you're not being too overly judgmental, that makes you a good person, and therefore you're going to heaven. But it's like, why would Christianity be appealing? Like, if you try to explain to some teenager, like, oh yeah, you could adopt the tenets of this faith in which you're not allowed to have premarital sex, or you could adopt the tenets of this faith which says you're allowed to have premarital sex as long as both parties kind of feel good about the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, most teenagers are going to opt for the second option if they don't know anything else, because that just seems more appealing. And as long as they're both saved in the end, why would it matter? So I think it's like this lack of judgmental attitude, like this live and let live attitude that kind of undermines people's entire worldview.
Sure.
Makes people think to themselves, like, why would I be a Christian if it asks so much of me? Why would I refrain from premarital sex, to just return to that example? Why would I do that if I'm going to be saved regardless? So I think it just, because it seems easier in some ways too, is another big reason.
I'm really interested in why it is that in the modern world being a good person seems to supersede being a person of faith, because it seems like our intuition, the sort of intuition of the culture in the modern world, is that it's more important to be a good person than to submit yourself and to have faith in the claims made by a particular religion.
And kind of like I
And
said earlier, I think it's because one of those two options is judgmental. To submit yourself to the claims of a particular religion is necessarily judgmental because you're saying that other religions are false.
mhm,
And therefore, kind of like how I was loosely touching on earlier, if you're being judgmental, then you're preventing someone from like feeling good, quote unquote. And if feeling good is the highest aspiration, then submitting yourself to a particular religion and claiming it to be true inhibits either you or other people around you from feeling good because to them that religion doesn't feel good. And this whole obsession with feeling good, probably maybe we could tie that back to like enlightenment ways of thinking or just general material affluence that say that spiritual realities don't really matter and all that
mhm,
matters is just kind of the goods of this world, which rest on feeling good, I suppose.
mhm. Maybe, all right. I have this idea in my head because I don't entirely agree with your evaluation of this, but I can't figure out how to exactly express my dissent. But I think one one point that might sort of help lay out my dissent a little bit is that I'm back to the person I described at the beginning of the episode. I'm imagining an individual who doesn't just have this lukewarm commitment to being a good person, but who is very conscious of the way in which they act and who does make an active commitment to be a moral person and to live a moral life. I'm
Mhm.
thinking of this person, um, and for me, that person, that person isn't they don't lack something that the person of faith possesses. Just uh, even if they don't submit themselves to the specific claims of one religion. And sorry, I don't know why, I just cannot express this idea in words, but it's I think this is like the cultural intuition that I'm talking about. That because I think even people who people who very much fall into the camp of moralistic therapeutic deism, who live these lives that a religious person might refer to as worldly, I think they would still exalt the person I've described who does pursue this very moral life. I think this is our intuition as a culture that morals are more important than than
Given
faith.
Jesus, let's say.
Sure, yeah, yeah. Oh, I think this is the best way to think about it. The teachings of Jesus are more important than having a relationship with Jesus himself.
Yeah, I think that's certainly an intuition because it isn't like there aren't many people who, yeah, there aren't many people who seem to say like, oh yeah, Jesus was a really bad man. Like, I feel like most people generally would say, even if you're not Christian, would generally say like, oh yeah, he was a good guy
Hmm.
because you're right. Like the things he teaches, like seem like love your neighbor as yourself or be forgiving. Like these are pleasant sounding notions that I think you're right. if you ask any non-religious person, like, oh yeah, what do you think about these moral tenets? Most of them will probably say, like, oh yeah, like that sounds great. Like I give that the thumbs up. But then when you get more into, like, oh yeah, but you also have to eat the body of this man and drink his flesh,
Mm-hmm.
then they're more like, oh no, like I don't want any part of that. That's weird.
Right.
And or like prayer, for instance, they might think, oh, that's just kind of a waste of time. I was talking about this with a friend last night, actually, in how like the it's part of worldliness, or it's part of worldliness to try to maximize utility. Like I'm sure you know what utilitarianism is, kind
Yes.
of just like maximizing pleasure for the greatest number of people, and it means that moral bounds aren't really absolute. It's kind of just a matter of like what will have the greatest consequence in theory. Like it's okay to kill people. It's okay to kill an innocent person if it means you'll save two more people, kind of thing. Like
Yeah.
that means you're maximizing utility. And I think Christianity is very much not a faith of maximizing utility. And I think I heard this quote from Bishop Robert Barron, where he said something like, the mass itself is the most useless thing anyone could do because it's not oriented towards it's not oriented towards something else. Like celebrating mass is kind of an end in and of itself intrinsically. Unlike working out, for instance, you might do for the sake of improving your health. Going to mass is more of an intrinsic thing. Like we recognize the intrinsic good of it, and therefore it's actually a higher good. Like because it's more useless, quote unquote, it's a higher good because like it is an end in and of itself. Whereas other things like the aforementioned working out are only goods because they lead to a higher good than that. But the mass going to mass is already at the pinnacle, and I think it kind of boils down to this idea that like we are human beings. Ultimately, we're not human doings, meaning we're not meant to just do things for the sake of maximizing utility in some sense, but that there is just an intrinsic inherent dignity within us. And I think faith, when you mention this person who is a very virtuous person, let's say, like they work out all the time, they engage in all these aesthetic practices, I would assume much of it may be to like maximize some form of utility. Or like if you're someone who's working 100 hours a week and you think that's a virtue,
Mm-hmm.
like you may be doing that so that you could like you're clearly someone who knows how to practice a form of self-denial. Like you're not just watching TikTok all day.
Right.
But and you may even be working out and stuff. But I think you have to say like what is the end goal for which you're doing this? Like is the end goal so that I can make as much money as possible and get all the girls I want and do drugs? Or is the end goal like something that transcends this world itself, namely a relationship with your loving creator? So I think we have to think about the scope of these things. Like the scope of Christianity is not like any utility or usefulness of worldly things. Like Christianity is done, the relationship with Jesus Christ himself is done for its intrinsic sake because we as Christians believe that that is the highest possible good.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where Christianity does still differentiate itself because like we
Right.
don't I think just looking at the teachings of Christ as opposed to looking at the relationship with the person necessarily means that you're going to have utility in mind as opposed to an intrinsic end.
I'm I'm thinking of I'm thinking of like if you look at the history of religion, it seems like it's this process of refinement. So like we start way back when by, you know, uh attributing like the wind and rain and like different natural processes to like the work of gods, right? And then like you get like a more refined polytheism out of that. And then eventually you get monotheism. Uh, and then eventually you get the Christian understanding of monotheism that comes out of the Jewish understanding of monotheism. And you might say the Christian understanding is even more refined than the Jewish understanding. Um, so it's like I'm almost thinking of it as like a funnel, uh, or maybe you could even think about it as like
No,
a
no, I think the funnel's a good analogy.
yeah, the funnel like
Yeah.
it's like moving towards like as it gets narrower, it's like moving
Yeah.
towards like absolute truth, capital T truth, if that exists. And so like for me, when I look at this trend of caring not so much about the having the relationship with Christ as wait, sorry, I just got lost in my words. So the trend is people generally don't care as much about having this relationship with Jesus for the good of it, for the sake of the relationship itself, as they do the, living by the teachings of Christ. And like I I think it's possible that this is just another iteration of religious refinement, because like okay, we now live in a very scientific world, and we also live in a very global world in the sense that we're very aware of other cultures and other religions. And because like okay, I think the two major reasons I lack a certain level of conviction in Christianity is one is because of the existence of other religions, and two is because of like my scientific understanding of the world. And I'm sure that a lot of people would share in this sentiment. And so like if we think of like religion as being constantly in this process of refinement, then I think it very plausible that science and like a more global understanding of things are factors which facilitate this refinement. And so we are now reaching a point further down the funnel where we don't care so much about like specific what would you call it? Like we don't find specific religious practices, like for example the Eucharist, super compelling, and we don't find specific religious claims like, for instance, in Christianity, purgatory or Mary's Immaculate Conception, anything like this. We don't find these super compelling either. And like when that is stripped away in this process of refinement, what we're left with is like the moral teachings espoused by many different religions throughout the world. And so the end result is like insofar as one lives their life in accord with these moral teachings, then one one is like in line with the will of God, the will of the unmoved mover. I'm not
See, here's what I'll say.
just to say one thing, and then I'll let you go. I don't. I'm not putting forth this idea as though I believe in it 100%, but it seems, based on the trends that we can observe in our world, this seems possible to me.
All right, here's what I'll say. Firstly, the people who do, if you look at those who do the most quote unquote good when it comes to things like caring for the poor in like third world countries, let's just take that as a specific example. The vast majority of these people who care for the poor in third world countries are priests, nuns, or general Christian missionaries. It's just a fact. Also, the argument you put forth a second ago was that we could say that there's more like modern understanding of faith in that we can kind of just collect a generalist list of moral principles from faiths around the world. The only argument you seem to put forth that this would be better than Christianity is that there's been a general trend throughout history of religions becoming better and more refined over time.
Sure.
And that it just makes sense that this trend would continue. But I feel like even that argument, so you're kind of saying like we start with these pagan tendencies and then and then there's Judaism, and then God reveals himself fully in the person of Jesus Christ. And like Christianity, we would say, is more complete than Judaism. Like even that argument to say that there's a trend of religions getting like better over time or more closer to the truth over time asserts that Christianity is like good and close to the truth.
Yeah.
So then I would argue that we have much of modern religion, whatever we would like to use the term for the modern religion that dominates Western civilization, call it moralistic therapeutic deism, call it just like liberalism broadly. I would say it is very, in a lot of ways, it is a reversion back to pagan practices in some sense, in that you have this explosion of people who call themselves spiritual but not religious, which they believe in some sort of spiritual realm, but if they don't want to deal with any sort of like more traditional religious structures. Their worship practices end up looking fairly similar to worship practices of like ancient pagan faiths,
Sure.
in that they have like all these weird like new age crystals or whatever, or they might believe in like these weird like nature spirits that surround them, or they use terms like Mother Earth, which I hate by the way because I think it's pagan, or they even practice child sacrifice through abortion, which could be a discussion we have for the future. Or they engage in just like they have completely unrestrained sexual ethics. Take just like the fact that most people engage in premarital sex, or like the transgender community, or like any of these modern deviant sexual practices, combined with child sacrifice, combined with all these like weird spiritual new agey practices. To me, these very much just resemble ancient paganism. So I would say,
But that's I think you would be incorrect to suggest that this is the way that a majority of people are living their lives. Like a majority of people are, at least in America, are just living their lives like our parents, which is to say that they're living generally good lives. They're not engaging in these like exceptionally deviant sexual practices. They're not they're not like um yeah, they're not like exceptionally far outside of the Christian understanding of morality. They would be less judgmental about people who do engage in certain less moral things as maybe a devout Christian would be, and they don't necessarily have the personal relationship with God that a devout
But
Christian would
so I
have.
guess that's why I started off by saying that the vast majority of people in the world who engage in like charity are Christian missionaries. Is that
I'm not sure of
I
that.
don't see someone who, what do you say?
Well, I would. I'm sure there are plenty of people from other religious traditions who are engaging in these practices as well. Maybe in the
Right,
United
you can look
States,
it up, but the vast majority are Christians.
who are engaging in what kind of charity?
Like traveling to third world countries to take like the corporal works of mercy, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, stuff like that for poor people.
Okay.
But that's just a specific brand of charity. What I was going to say though is that I don't think you could look at the lives of someone who I think you should if you look at the lives of someone who is living a more traditional Christian who lives a more traditional Christian life, I would say the vast majority of the time that person is going to be more virtuous or generally more joyous than the person who just lives a quasi atheist, moralistic therapeutic deist type lifestyle where they just adopt all of the modern secular tropes pertaining to like premarital sex or contraception or you name it, just like whatever a moralistic therapeutic deist would support. The Christian is just going to live a better, more joyous life than that other person. And obviously, if you're not a Christian listening to me say this, you won't agree with that. But I think rather than just saying the argument, rather than just saying, oh, religions tend to become better and more refined over time, therefore moralistic therapeutic deism or
I'm
some
not
sort
saying
of like,
moralistic therapeutic deism is anywhere near.
or yeah, no, that's why I'm going to restate what I just said. The argument, rather than saying religions tend to get better over time, so therefore we should just adopt this more like generalist understanding of faith that kind of like doesn't have any clear doctrines, but more or less just picks out the doctrines that seem to be good and virtuous from
Mhm.
faiths around the world and live your life that way. Rather than saying that's better because it's more recent and the trend is that religions get better, we should just analyze these specific lives and virtues put forth by Christianity versus whatever this generalist modern religion would be,
I
and
think
then say, what do you say?
I think you're straw manning, and maybe I straw manned it myself, but like I'm thinking, I'm imagining a person who would pursue ultimate truth in this kind of way would do it in a way kind of like the ancient Greek philosophers, right? And like we wouldn't say we wouldn't we wouldn't think that the ancient Greek philosophers were just kind of like grasping at like vague moral teachings, or like picking and choosing different moral teachings from the religions that they were aware of. Like they had this understanding that truth was that the capital T truth was out there and it could be discovered, and they committed themselves to uncovering this truth through intellectual investigation and through the ways in which they lived as well. And yeah, I suppose that's the point I wanted to make, is that and also I think that that a person who lives their life in in that way is sort of, maybe I've explained this on the podcast before, but I think that they're like starting from down here, and they're recognizing like there is some kind of ultimate truth, and they're like slowly trying to build towards it, slowly trying to discover it. Whereas I think a person who is more religiously inclined, is sort of accepting claims about ultimate truth from whatever religion they subscribe to, and then sort of like figuring out ways to justify, to argue for, to prove that claim which they've already accepted. Maybe, and I think I may be strawmanning Christianity there.
Yeah, no,
But
so
that's kind of the point I wanted to make.
yeah, because the ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle obviously did not have, like, the incarnation had yet to occur.
Sure.
And but I guess you would argue that it's better to have it's better to understand why your view of the world is a particular way than just having some institution tell you it is this particular way, and then you just subscribe to that belief.
I don't want to strawman Christianity like that, because I think that there are plenty of Christians who do have this rigorous intellectual understanding of what they believe in. But I still think what's going on there is like a, no, I don't think I have the words to explain that. You can go ahead.
I was just waiting to see what you were gonna say.
Okay, let me try to say it then. Um, because okay, in Christianity, there are certain claims up here that you have to accept in order to be a Christian at all. Whereas in the Greek philosophical way of life, like, it's not, you don't have to accept claims like the Eucharist, claims like the Immaculate Conception of Mary, claims like purgatory exists. You don't have to accept these claims, which can often be very hard to wrap our minds around, and which, at least for me, feel just like the claims of other religions that I have absolutely no reason to believe in. So in this Greek philosophical way, you don't have to accept any of those claims. Um, I suppose the only sort of guiding principle you do have to accept or have conviction in is that there is kind of this ultimate spiritual truth, and we as human beings have the means to pursue and discover that truth. And also, I suppose you would accept that walking the path towards that truth is better than just dismissing it entirely.
Okay, so two things I want to say, and then we'll wrap up. I do find it, and I hate for this to be like a gotcha thing, because like I do find it interesting though that you were making the argument of religions tend to get better and refined over time, and then you pointed to the ancient Greeks, which obviously occurred before Christianity.
Sure.
However, but then, so again, like, I don't really have much more to say other than just like, gotcha, whatever. So forget I said that.
No, no, no.
But
Yeah, it's a fair point to bring up. I won't address it now, but yeah, go ahead.
so the second question I want to ask you before we end here, and I think this could be a good segue into our next episode, is so I just want to confirm you do believe in a capital T objective truth.
Well, I suppose that when we're talking about objective, it may just be the case that you and I have different understandings of what objective means. I would say, based on my experiences, it feels to me as though there is, let's call it a spiritual realm. Uh, there is something greater than the material world. And I, as a human being, have some part of me, like a soul, which connects me to that. Um, and therefore, I am not merely, I am not merely a complex animal who is far along in the process of evolution, but am a being who is meant to exists for a reason, and whose life is attached to eternity in some real way. Now, I recognize the shortcomings of this worldview because it all sounds a little bit vague, which is something we've talked about before. And so there is like a desire for it to be more personal. Or there, I guess, a question of should it be more personal? You know, am I just getting like halfway to Christianity? I guess, to make a long story short, my answer for you would be yes, I do believe in this objective capital T truth.
All right, so I think the questions we should discuss in the next episode are, you do believe in this objective capital T truth, but you think that Christianity isn't quite there for whatever reason. And I know you mentioned like because other faiths exist. So I think in the next episode we should discuss like what do you think, how would your God behave? Like,
Right.
how do you think God should behave?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of how he chooses to reveal himself, why Christianity falls short in that sense. And yeah, I think if you take some time and think about that, we could have a really fruitful discussion next time.
Okay.
All right.
I suppose.
Without that said, all you millions of listeners, we hope you enjoy. I will be praying for all of you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on A Disciple.
And a doubter.
So
Peace
long.
out.